support for students who are affected by hate or harassment. And so we would recommend that you make students aware of that if it's relevant to them if you work at DMU. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking our panel to introduce themselves and just tell us a little bit about their work in placements at DMU. So Charlotte, would you mind kicking things off?
Hi all, thanks for coming along. Rob and I work together in the audiology team, and I hate to do this to you, Rob, but I think you're the best person to kind of introduce placements and what we do, and then I can talk a bit more about how I try to support it in professional practice. That's all right?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rob, I'm the placement lead for audiology. So to give you a bit of background, with audiology, we send students out on placement as a compulsory part of the course, typically as far afield as places like Yorkshire and all the way down to the south coast. Most audiology placements tend to be kind of one-on-one, or sometimes they'll take 2 students in the department, but not often. And they the model of placement we have in audiology is they're there for 32 weeks. Which is a continuous placement with they get a bit of holiday allowance as well. We predominantly send students to the NHS, but we also have a partnership with Specsavers that provide NHS care in terms of audiology as well. So anything else, Charlotte, you think is relevant?
I think probably the most, yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I think the other thing to say is that probably it's fair to say year on year, ever since the kind of inception of the course, students have felt very anxious about going away to placement.
Oh yes, I forgot all about that. So yeah, so we try and facilitate things like disability and other needs that students have, but because of the nature of our course, we can't place every student in a particular city. It just isn't a feasibility at all. So coming onto the course, students have to sign a document to say they understand that, but then each cohort that comes through to the relevant point of the course, we have, it does fluctuate, to be fair, from year group to year group. We have a significant number that express concerns and anxieties about where they're going to go. Not so much the actual work. Oh, yeah. Sorry
to interrupt you. We're just moving on with the debate. I'd just like to invite Idalina to introduce herself, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Idalina Rodriguez and I'm one of the senior lecturers and the clinical lead on the speech and language therapy programme. And my role, similar to Rob, is really about looking after the placements that our speech and language therapy students do. Just like in audiology, our placements are a mandatory part of the course, and all of our students kind of go to a range of different places, particularly in the second and final year where they have clinical placements. And they go across the East Midlands area, and they are involved in a whole range of kind of work. So wherever a speech and language therapist might be, or wherever speech and language therapists who they might be working with, that's where our students can be found. So kind of community settings, hospitals, schools, other education settings, etc. All of our students have a range of placements throughout the course, so they get a range of experiences, and it's really kind of interesting to think about, as well as the kind of practicalities of sending them out into placement and what they need to learn, their experiences there. So I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you all. So sorry Rob for just jumping in, but there's so much to debate, and I just wanted to make sure everyone got a chance to introduce themselves. So I wonder if you'd start off by addressing the question, really, what have placements got to do with decolonising DMU and anti-racist practice? Perhaps you could kind of just say a little bit about how those things are related to one another. Idalina, do you want to kick off and then?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think what the major point as I see it is, in programs like ours and all the programs that include elements of placements, the learning that our students, their student experience, their learning, their experience of their development doesn't just happen on campus. It isn't just something that happens in their lectures or their seminars. they when they're out on placement, they are learning, they are doing all of the things that they need to do in order to qualify. They're getting that knowledge and experience, and so anything that impacts them in those settings is part of their learning and therefore part of their program, part of their experience. So if they experience and that includes the really positive things that they experience, but also difficult issues and some of the difficulties that they might experience as part of their placement learning, which can include those kind of experiences of racism. So in terms of what has placement got to do with this, I think it's because it's part of their learning, everything they experience as part of their study is related. And if there are unfortunately circumstances where just like in workplaces up and down the land, if these things are happening, this is part of the student experience, this is part of what's happening to them, and therefore it becomes something crucial for us to think about.
Rob and Charlotte, what would you want to add to that?
Shall I go? Yeah, I echo that. The placement experience, and you guys are here because you're interested in placement. We know that it's such valuable experiential learning, and certainly from my perspective, we can send off some students who perhaps have got very theoretical ideas about what an ear is, and maybe a little bit about the fact that an ear is attached to a person in the world of audiology. But it's often not until those students come back from placement that I see a real shift and change in their motivations, their enthusiasm, their, for want of a better term, their kind of audiology mojo really kicks in, because they've seen some real life people and they know that they've been able to affect some change. And that's a really powerful motivator. But the challenge can be when you're seeking out that experiential learning, but the situation, the personalities, the culture, all of that has to be right within the placement to be able to support our students. At DMU, a lot of our students in audiology sit in a very kind of close bubble where they have a really strong sense of community. A lot of our students come from the local area. Many might be related and have strong community connections with Leicester or Birmingham. And then we're asking them to make quite a change and quite a shift in what they know. We had a guy, I can't remember which year group he was, Rob, you'll remember. But he was, it was done in a jokey way, but he was quite concerned about us sending him to a hospital where it felt like a forest. Do you remember that? Because it felt so alien to him, and the assimilation caused him a lot of anxiety. So for us as a team, it's really important that we know that and understand that for our students, but also how we then try to understand and support placements so that they can try and foster that sense of belonging so that our students get a better experience while they're there.
Yeah, I think to add to that, there's also an element of growth and development away from the core subject as well, so away from audiology, away from speech therapy. Myself and Charlotte and Idley have had lots of talks about that more tacit skill set that grows from personal development, and I think there was a fear of that kind of need to have engagement with people outside of that immediate sphere of their peer group and their lecturers, which they're going to have to do if they're working in a hospital or in a public facing kind of sector. So I think a lot of the anxieties don't come from the technical side of things. It's from more of the social interactions and how to deal with certain situations that they seem very aware of and very fearful of. And I think the added concept of racism thrown in there just makes it a very challenging thing for a lot of young people to deal with. Absolutely. And
I do think it's an important it's an important consideration for, particularly for our students, because they're working in the healthcare sector. It'll be an important part of their role. They're working with the public. They're working with people who themselves might be experiencing these issues. And so for our students to be part of their placement learning is about learning what are the issues that impact the people that one day I'm going to be qualified to be working with and supporting, and with racism being one of those. Yeah, it's important that they're exposed to this and they have these discussions.
So, I mean, maybe Rob can pick up on this first of all, because I think it picks up a thread that you were talking about earlier, Rob, which is what are the kinds of issues and concerns that students raise or have raised with you, linking to issues about racism and the placement experience, or not just racism, but issues relating to ethnicity, culture, and so on.
Sure. I think it's really sort of there's a lot of detail to pick apart there, really, because you could get down to quite granular kind of differences between male and females from a similar background, have very different experiences, different challenges. The student that Charlotte mentioned earlier, his big fear when he looked up the hospital he was going to, it was a greenfield site, so it was out of the city centre. And his fear very much reminded me of a Germanic kind of fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel kind of thing, that he was going to a woodland setting, and he had never experienced that before. He didn't know what the countryside was like. He's bizarrely now travelling the country as a rep, so he's got lots of experience now of travelling around the country. So I think a lot of it is fear of things happening rather than knowing things would happen. We've had lots of conversations with students where when you ask them what their concerns are, they often use the phrase, what if this happens? What if so and so occurs? So it's almost like they don't have a tool set initially to kind of deal with certain situations that perhaps more experienced people would have. So that's a big aspect. There's also that fear of the unknown, I guess. When I first came into this role, one of the big things was around being away from home. Now our students, particularly in audiology, don't get any financial help from government in terms of their studies. There's no kind of bursaries for travel or placements and so on. And again, that seems to affect different people in different ways, or they all have an element of concern. There's also, I think, a little bit of concern where one student might be placed in a sense of whether they're the only student, and they might have other students whether paired, or I think there's one placement that has traditionally taken 3 or 4 students, and there's that concern about what that means. Will I have some peer support, won't I? But equally, those that do have peer support, there seems to be this competition that arises very quickly. Am I developing as quickly as this other person on my placement? Am I behind my peers? And that seems to stretch across all different types of students from all different backgrounds. So I think as a kind of overriding thing, it does often seem to be the fear of the unknown, the what if kind of question, rather than there being physical, tangible things to say that in that part of the country on that placement there have been issues before. I mean, thankfully, actually, in my time on the course, I think there's only been maybe 2 occasions where there's been a very clear case of racism, but thankfully both of those have been away from the placement. They've been within the wider city that the student is living in at the time. Still not great, obviously, but it's thankfully it's not been in the placement. And I think that partly goes down to places like the NHS having fairly robust mechanisms to help deal with that kind of situation. So if it does start to rear its ugly head, there are things to kind of protect the student and the other clinicians in that moment. And certainly when we bring graduates back during the course, or we bring students back from the placement, they very quickly seem to mature. They seem to have more awareness, more ability to cope with things, and certainly sometimes they come in after maybe even 3 months on placement, so they seem to have aged 2 or 3 years. They're sort of more experienced characters, I guess, and those fears seem to disappear with the experience a little bit, I think, in most cases.
Adelina, are those similar concerns that are raised with speech and language therapy?
I think, interestingly, I was just thinking about sort of the experiences. Rob talked clearly about the sort of the concerns raised but maybe if I mention some of the experiences that students have talked about. And the thing I suppose that I've noted most recently is the students' kind of discussion around what I suppose I now know, or we now call in the last few years, it's a term used more, those microaggressions. So perhaps things that students before, and I know from my own experience personally, might not have raised, might have thought, well, you know, that's just something that happens, or even wonder whether, okay, this has happened, but is it something that I should go and talk to my lecturers about? Is it something I should go and talk to my personal tutor about? So one of the things that I've noticed most recently, kind of just reflecting back on the question of what experiences have students discussed or raised around placement, are where students have said, you know, Idalina, this happened on placement. Where somebody said to me, or is that an example recently was a student who said, one of the service users, so the patients, the individuals I was working with, asked me, is that your real name? Is that your real name? Because in that individual's perception, they were not expecting that student and the way they looked and the ethnicity that they were from to have that particular name. Or a student who, another student who said, you know, people assumed that I wouldn't be celebrating Christmas, and it's those kind of things where, you know, I've not experienced a time where a student has come to me and said, you know, here's an overt example. This is something I've been called, or a name that's been used to describe me, or an incident where this has happened. And I know that, you know, those things happen from personal experience. I know they happen, but I think what I've really noticed is that those incidences that unfortunately students perhaps do experience, but might not bring that kind of internal, where's my threshold for something that I will go and talk to my lecturer about, or will raise with my clinician. And often, and I know I'm perhaps jumping ahead to think about, you know, what do we do in those situations, or how that happens. And I think the key things for me is, often I feel sometimes what the student initially wants, and it shouldn't end there, but is almost is this a real thing, Idalina? Did that really happen? Or is this something that is, worthy is the wrong word, but is this something that I should be coming to share? Is this something I should be coming to talk about? And I think that kind of one of the things that we in the SLT team have really tried to do is create that space and talk about some of those things, and, you know, share our own experiences, so that it allows people to kind of think, well, yeah, that, you know, that happened to me, it made me feel uncomfortable, and yes, this is something, I'm not wasting anybody's time by raising this, or this isn't just a part of life that I should just, oh, that's unfortunate it happened, but that's just one of those things. So I think the things that I've most noticed recently is where students are coming forward with those, what I suppose we now call microaggressions.
Thanks, Idalina. So I just want to bring Charlotte in, and Charlotte, I wonder if you would talk a bit about this idea of belonging, because when Rob was talking about those incidents taking place not in placement but in the kind of city where people are placed, it's part of that kind of experience, and so I'm wondering whether students reflect on that and their kind of sense of being at home, both in the placement but also in the kind of wider location where they're placed.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and we're very reliant on the situation where they're placed to have a developed understanding, really, of what Idalina's just been talking about, to enable that to happen in the moment. So the example Idalina's just used, that the word that came to mind was that those students are seeking validation of their experiences and affirmation of their experience. And a lot of the toolkit actually that I've just put in the chat talks a bit about this idea of sense of belonging and the relevance and importance of having a near peer, so that you have someone who you can relate to and someone perhaps available in the moment, so that you're able to share that experience and almost have that check-in of, is that right? I don't know that that's right. A lot of our students have said things like, patients have asked them, well, where are you from? I'm from Leicester. No, where are you really from? And how to answer that question in a way that maintains the dynamic in the room, that calms everything down, that enables them to get back to their script, because they're still learning and they need to be able to follow what they're trying to do in a clinical appointment and not be thrown off by something that can stir up a whole other agenda in the room. So it's really relevant for us to work with placement providers, educators, those support people that we have in the space, to be able to foster that idea and that sense of having a near peer and a sense of belonging. Rob and I have worked together a really, really long time, and we work together in the NHS. And something that he set up probably far too many years ago now that we shouldn't divulge, was a mentor system within a placement, so that we knew then that a student at any given moment would have someone to check in with, to have that reality check, almost that experience of validation. Can we go for a quick drink? This has just happened. Has that happened to you? Should it happen? And I do think services are becoming more aware and getting better at that. But I also think that for too long things go unsaid, and because a microaggression is just that, it's micro. How big is the micro? And what impact is that having on our students and their stress levels, and then their ability to perform how they want to? For us, we often tell them that it's a 32-week job interview. And in a job interview, you want to perform your best, don't you? And you can't if you're stressed and you're feeling displaced and not right. So part of the bigger agenda for us in the toolkit is exploring that dynamic and thinking about ways that we can introduce a level of mentoring, near peer support, so that there's someone in the moment that you can explore that interaction with, whatever that interaction was. And I know we'll probably move on to that, but there are ways as well that we've tried to tackle it here at DMU. And I mean, just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of extremities of some things our students have reported back. And we didn't actually hear about this until after the student had finished and she came back to support some sessions that we run. But one of our students, while she was on placement, she was on placement and she was in like a healthcare setting running a clinic. Was she on placement or had she finished by then, Rob? Actually, she might have finished. She might have been graduated. And it was just after the Manchester Arena bombing, and she was in clinic the next day, and the patient walked in and accused her of being part of that particular incident. It's an incredibly powerful story, and it's definitely not a microaggression. But for her, how do you manage that? How? And how do you carry on seeing the patient and get through your pattern of care, what you need to do, and where's the support for that? And that's a very extreme example of what people experience, but it's there. And like Idalina was saying, you're dealing with the public all day, every day. So yeah, for us, it's about how we can use those very powerful experiences to not frighten our group of students, but to be honest and real about what can happen and how we foster support and how we enable them to develop, I suppose, some skills preemptively, but also how we put that support bubble around them. Sorry, I've got excited about that bit. I've started to waffle on.
Thank you, Charlotte. And just before Idalina comes in, Sarah's popped a question into the chat, which I think is kind of pertinent to this bit of the debate, sort of looking at how do we support students to recognise and challenge racism within a placement, and in a way that sort of helps them to develop their understanding of the impact of racism on their practice development. So that sounds like a good time to kind of move things on to thinking about what is it that you're doing as teams, all of you, to try and support students in that way, to try and equip them to deal with those situations. So if I can turn to Idalina first, because I think, Idalina, you've got a recent initiative that you started within SLC.
Yeah, so we very recently had the most recent of our a kind of a panel where we include students, members of the team, people from across the university, and plan to invite sort of practice educators, so the speech and language therapists and their teams that the students are going to be working with to discuss these issues, to talk about the students' experiences on placements, to talk about our experiences as staff, because I think that is a really important step in just, I think the fact that our students see and are part of a discussion makes them feel, because just as Charlotte was talking, I was thinking that sometimes it is a long time after the event that we hear about it, because it takes the student that time to kind of process, to understand what's happened, and to feel like to feel like that they can share that this is something that they need to discuss. And I think as Charlotte and Rob were talking, I was really thinking about one of the most important things that we need to do, or two things really, is recognize the context that our students are in, because this is a kind of the context is really important. They're on a placement where they're learning. They feel like it's a one long assessment period. They sense that hierarchy of, there's somebody there that's qualified and skilled that's going to be assessing them. They feel like they're in a situation where, of course, they've got lots to learn. They're not feeling at their most confident perhaps anyway. So then if an incident happens in that situation, it's kind of, sometimes students say, I didn't want to make a fuss. I didn't want to challenge anything because I didn't want that to have a negative impact on my placement. So our role, and one of the things we're doing, is having those discussions so students see that this is important. This does need to be discussed. And I think a bit of a challenge, if I might throw in one that we've been discussing, is how do we include all students in this? How do we include, when we have our equality, diversity and inclusion discussions and panels, how do we see students to see, how do we help students, I should say, to see that this is everybody's business? This doesn't only apply to, if we might promote something, it might be students feel like, oh, that's for students who are from an ethnic minority background, or that's for students with a disability. But to how do we support our students to see that this is something that we're all involved in, either as an individual who's had an experience or part of that experience, or an ally? How do we include everybody? And so our approach to kind of including, it's not something that's kind of, here's something we've prepared to do with the students, but let's develop this discussion. Let's have these discussions together with the students, with the placements, because this is going to be something that they experience.
Thanks, Idalina. And I think that idea of learning from other people's experiences is really crucial to the work that I think Charlotte and Rob have been doing on their course. So I'm going to just kind of turn to them to tell us a little bit about the work that they've been engaged in.
Yes, the placement panels that we've had in audiology for a few years now, 2, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. 2019. They are really useful. They take a bit of planning, and I think, like Idalina was saying, thinking about your student cohort, you want to have a range of people on that panel, not just people from DMU, but people from placement providers.
Rob, could you just Can you just give the background about what a placement panel is? Just
So we essentially invite all the students that are about to go into placements to attend this panel. Myself and Charlotte spend half a year trying to drag people in from different parts of the country and get them on the panel, but we try and make it as broad as possible. So we have various people from DMU on it to help facilitate it and talk about the kind of support mechanisms that are available already in the university. And then we'll have a range of placement providers. These could be anyone from head to service to clinical trainers. And then we try and get recent graduates, so last few years or so, and students that are currently on placement on the panel as well. And interestingly, I don't know if you feel this, Charlotte, but I think as we've developed it more, our role on the placement panel has actually become less and less because it becomes more organic. So the conversations, you kind of, like with any body of students, you have to kind of encourage them to take part initially because they're quite shy or don't want to be on stage, so to speak. But very quickly, it almost becomes like a clinical supervision session where the passion of the subject comes out from these people, and the students are almost watching a separate discussion between two panel members about a particular thing that they're very passionate about around this subject. So it's become really, really powerful, and I think provides not only that awareness that other people have had experiences and this is how they've tackled with their experiences, their learning, their journey behind it, but having things like the heads of service there or placement providers there, they'll often then start talking about the policies within placement that they use to help protect their own staff, how they then integrate students into that. And I think the student interaction gets more and more as that panel progresses. I think we don't generally do it for about 2 hours, I think 2, maybe 3 hours, and it goes like that because the conversations that come out are so passionate. And I think that's where things like Mentimeter, that kind of technology, allows the students to take part without feeling like they're on stage, and you tend to find that I think more interesting topics arise or more interesting comments from the students arise because they don't want to feel on stage particularly. So that technology really does dovetail rather with that concept of this placement panel. So Charlotte, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are lots of different dynamics around placement panel that perhaps are the less seen elements to it. The first thing to say is that we work with Rachel on it, so that the power dynamic shifts from us as lecturers delivering material, delivering content, and here are our externals. I really wanted to get away from that to make a shift in the dynamic, because I think we see that all the time, particularly with our demographic and on our course. So the first thing to do was try to break that down a little bit and make it less formal. The other element, I suppose, is that we try to replicate that near peer idea by thinking about the alumni that we bring in order to try to support the panel. Rob and I look a certain way, and we are perhaps less relatable in lots of ways. Whereas our immediate alumni who've been through the course, have been through a process, have got a bit of work experience behind them, and perhaps a little bit more life experience, are much more relatable for our students. And we don't sit and kind of prime them and say this and don't say this. We just let it flow because we want their honesty and we want them to bring their authentic selves. The other element is that the faith leaders help us enormously, because of elements that we don't know about particularities of someone's faith and practice of their faith, and how that replicates into a workplace, and what the protocols are around that, for want of a better term. But that's incredibly important to someone, and they're moving into a space where there's some anxiety about being able to carry out practice that they would normally practice. And for a lot of our alumni, they've had that experience and they've made it work in the centres that our students are going to. So we're able to kind of prime them to talk about that stuff. And the great use of kind of anonymized questioning is that if those particular areas of questioning haven't come up, then I can sling in a few more pertinent ones in order for us to kind of dig into those subjects a bit more. It's the session of the year that I get by far the best feedback for from our students. They all come away, that was amazing, it was so good, it was great to meet them, I really understand it now. And there seems, to me, there's a shift in fear of placement to looking forward to it, albeit with a bit of trepidation. But the mood tends to shift, and I do put a lot of that down to what we're able to do in that space. We also try to make sure that we celebrate the alumni coming in and whoever supports us. So there's always a kind of scrabbling around for budget for lunch afterwards, and celebrating them being here, because that's really important too, and we want them to come back.
Thank you. I mean, I've taken part in some of the panels, and I think what I think is quite transformative about them is that it's a place where explicitly we discuss racism in a placement and what racist incidents practitioners have faced, and so that, you know, it's not a hidden subject. Therefore, because of the makeup of the panel, because of the alumni, it's bringing it into the open. Ali's raised a question in the chat, which is about how to develop allies for students. So it's everybody's business to challenge racism in placements. And I wonder if this links in a little bit as well to kind of what about the professional bodies for your professions? Because you're both in healthcare, you've got professional bodies that support not only students but practitioners working in the field. So I wonder if we can pick up on Ali's point about allies and allyship and what professional bodies are doing or not to kind of support that. Maybe Eileen, if you would kick us.
Yeah, well, so the professional body for speech and language therapy is the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and the RCSLT have got a range of resources on their website for around this work, and there have been some recent kind of webinars and quite easily accessible material for students and for clinicians around racism and experiences that their members have had, and sharing that. And I think for our students, that's really powerful. It's something that we signpost to as relevant, but also kind of share some of that, because just listening to the kind of information about the panel, what is almost as a starting point from the conversations I've had with some of my students is the fact that those resources exist, in fact, before they've even accessed them or opened them or used them, the fact that they're there, that this is a real thing that people are talking about, that is being taken seriously, that somebody has that is important enough. So therefore I should share my I can share my experiences. And I think the fact that those things are coming from our professional body, as well as other so there's some really kind of useful resources and e-learning from Health Education England that students have access to, the fact that material exists and it's something we're using and talking about, and the fact that they can hear, exactly as Charlotte and Rob were saying, hear people that they hear qualified practitioners talking about their experiences. There's something really powerful about hearing those personal stories of people that are in the position that one day you want to be in terms of kind of, the job role that they do. So I think the fact that those webinars are taking place, those discussions are taking place, where students can see not just us as lecturers or the person that's assessing their placement, because there is that kind of power dynamic that in some ways is difficult to get away from. The fact that they can hear people and professionals discussing these things, the fact that they can hear somebody who, who's a speech and language therapist who's specializing in the area that they want to get into one day, sharing their personal experiences, sharing what they've done and what they've learned and how the things that they've grown and realized, that's really powerful to our students. So I think the fact that it comes from our professional body is really, really helpful, and bolsters the work that we do here.
Thanks, Idalina. And Charlotte and Robert, is there a similar kind of support from the audiology point of view?
I'll dive in there and go, not to that extent, no. We're very jealous of the speech and language therapy world in that regard. I think within our profession, student-focused themes has probably fallen off the radar a little bit for the professional body. We don't have a college in the same way that Idalina does, hence the jealousy from people like me and Charlotte. There's a scientific body and a professional body, but there's probably about 3 professional bodies, and it seems to be at the moment, I would say it's quite reactionary for audiology. So when it's in the media, they'll do something, they'll put a statement out, but there isn't the kind of resources embedded in the same way there is in speech therapy. That's much more, I would argue, much more left to the universities to pick up, really, which is a shame, but that's the stark reality of it.
Yeah, and it's I was a director for the professional body, and I finished in 2020. Yeah, and part of the work we did was to set up an equality and diversity portfolio, because we didn't have one before that point. And slowly but surely, I've been trying to guide our students towards becoming part of that committee. And I remember being at the professional body conference last year with a couple of our students who were presenting their work, which was fantastic. And I said something about, come on, you're the future of this profession, isn't it exciting? And they laughed at me, and I said, why are you laughing? And they went, well, it's funny because everyone around here really looks like you. There aren't a lot of people that look like us. And I said, well, yeah, that's part of the challenge. But all these people are going to grow old and they're going to retire. And you're here. But what we lack very much in audiology from professional bodies is that element of mentoring and near peer support. It just isn't there. I also just, if it's okay, I just wanted to pick up on a comment in the chat around this idea of a subconscious deficit perception. I really agree. I think it's very true. And we have to strive to oppose that. We have to strive to move away from that. And I think one of the key reasons that why placement panel works is because we bring in successful females, males who are much more relatable, and we start to see chips away at that idea of deficit or that idea of being less good somehow.
And it is so important. I think it makes the point, like your students at the conference and just comments I have heard from my own students. It is so important for them to see that diversity in the places they are going to, that those workplaces are going to be their workplaces in the future. So it's so powerful and important to see people that look, so you can see that it's a possibility that somebody from your background, somebody that you can relate to, can be in that position. And I think that's one of the things that I probably didn't anticipate so much in starting in this role. The conversations I've had with students where they've said, I remember a student saying to me, I've not met any other speech and language therapists that look like me. You're the first speech and language therapist that I've met that's from my background. Or I didn't, and one student said to me, I didn't think that one of my lecturers would be South Asian like me. And it's that kind of importance for our students to see themselves in the workplaces that they go into, see themselves in, and that starts happening on placement, and it doesn't have to it's showing them that there's that possibility. And I think part of our role there is kind of not, these are difficult conversations to have. I put my hand up and say it can, and I wonder if others on the panel can relate, that these are really difficult conversations to have with our students. They can be really uncomfortable. I often find myself kind of thinking, am I saying the right thing? Is this helpful? Is this supportive of my student? But I think that the thing that we can't do is, and I'm not suggesting any of us do, but we can't do is kind of shy away from those difficult conversations, or those difficult things that the students might talk about, their experiences, their worries, their concerns, their thoughts and their ideas about what would make it better for them. I think and I can really see, I'll hold my hands up and say it's the type of conversation that I'd found particularly difficult, still is difficult to have with students, but it feels like it's so important.
It really is. I was just reminded of a student recently who's gone on to placement in Bridlington, and I know this is your story, Rob, because you ended up speaking with her, but I think she'd heard some rumours, felt it wasn't an okay place to go for a number of reasons, and we could have, what she was seeking in that moment was a reactive, okay, well, we'll take you away. Okay, you don't have to go there. But the reality of that for us is that, well, we haven't really got anywhere else to send you. But equally, for her, how do we support her in that moment so that we don't just react back? How do we try to support her, coach her? And I think the outcome's very good, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that came from having a very open, honest conversation about the situation she was in, and I think helping her to come up with options actually came from her. Like Charlotte just said, there wasn't an option to send her to a different part of the country. Post-COVID, I'm sure it's the same with Eileen, the placements are 10 times harder to actually find in the first place, so that they're drying up at a horrific rate. But I think, given that the student was quite a young and experienced person, I think, again, going back to a point Eileen made, is about the affirmation of those concerns, but then trying to work with a young person to draw out the sensible solutions that would work in that context. And thankfully we did that with her, and touch wood, still is the case that she's having a wonderful experience, because I think she felt quite empowered that with a bit of help, a bit of coaching, she came up with sensible solutions to the situation she was in. Some of the conversation, just to put a light spin on it, were around good pubs to go to in the area she was in, which seems to have worked to a degree, but I guess won't work with every student.
Thank you, Rob. That's really great. I'm just conscious of time, and we've got a couple of things to pick up from the chat. But also, I was reminded of was my colleague Blessing did a session earlier in the week in this series of events, where that same issue of representation came up, really, where students had said to Blessing that seeing her in the staff body had been reassuring and helpful, and that just kind of was echoed, I think, Idalina, then in the comments that your students were raising with you. So that seems to be a thread that's run through a few of the events that we've had this week. So Josephine, we addressed a bit your comment. Is there any more that you'd like to say on that particular issue about subconscious deficit perceptions? I don't know if you wanted to come in and add to the conversation that had happened there. And if not, that's absolutely fine. Ali's also mentioned the issue of safe spaces in order to have conversations, and I think you've kind of alluded to that particular issue in what you've said, but I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add around that issue of kind of safety and safe spaces.
Yeah, I'm trying to frame it in my mind. Thoughts quicker than speech. Something around the idea of a safe space, but I'm choosing, I might be wrong, Ali, but I'm kind of choosing to interpret that as safe to be honest, direct, and try to support that kind of management of conflict. You know, we've had situations before now, pre-COVID, where, Rob, I think I'm right in thinking that a student's father has actually come in with her to demand that she didn't go on a particular placement. So in terms of, I suppose, from an academic perspective, it's how you follow the right processes within that. So that's kind of our safe space, and the support you get in order to try to manage that situation, but also how you can maintain the right message and ensure the student has the correct support while they're there, and how you can reassure them of that. I also think it would be lovely to have some sort of central DMU documentation that our students have as part of their placement experience, that is essentially a quick guide to almost, here are your resources, here's what you can think about, almost like a little card or something that you keep on your lanyard when you're walking around a hospital or something like that, as a way of checking in, because I think that would help create some feeling of safety and some feeling of support from us while they're away too. I know we kind of drop emails left, right and centre and see if we get responses, but and have the odd Teams calls from those students who engage. But I think we could do more in terms of how we set up the preparation, but also as well offer that kind of debrief more towards the end of a placement too.
Idalina, do you want to add to anything there about that kind of notion of safe spaces that Ali's?
Yeah, I think as well, my own reflection would be the recognition for staff and students that these things aren't easy to talk about, and there has to be that, how can I put it, it takes a while to perhaps feel that, yes, I can have this conversation in my workplace or in relation to my placement. There might be influences or kind of concerns about what impact might this have? What impact is this going to have on me as a member of staff or me as a student? It feels different to, talking to your friends or talking to your family, where you are in a kind of professional space where wrongly, because I don't think, I've never felt like there is a negative consequence to me sharing my experiences or my concerns with my line manager or anything like that, but I can see how a student or a member of staff may feel worried about kind of sharing their concerns because of the perception of, what might the impact be, what negative impact could it have on my placement. So I think that we have a really key role with our students and colleagues to make sure it's clear that you will be listened to, your concerns won't be dismissed. The acknowledgement, and the thing I've probably found the most useful, is saying to students, gosh, this feels like a difficult conversation, doesn't it? It's important. We're talking about, it's not a difficult conversation. This is a difficult issue. It's important. We might not be able to have all the answers, but exactly as Rob said, that kind of, this is not about you, this is with you. So let's work together so that we can solve that. And I think that's the same as a member of staff. So I think Ali's point about a safe space is a really important one. And that's how I kind of interpret that just that kind of having the discussion is helpful, that acknowledgement that this is something we will talk about, we need to talk about, we'll work it out together. It's not necessarily about we can make it better or we can take away the difficulty, but this is something we will do together.
Thank you, Idalina. And we're just about to run out of time. So I think that's a good note to end on. And thank you to all three of you for taking part and sharing your experience, your students' experiences with us today. And thank you for people listening and who took part in the chat. Just to remind you of the link that Charlotte posted is a link to a resource that's part of our Decolonising DMU Toolkit. So Charlotte's written a resource around the work that she and her team have done relating to supporting students on placement. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that resource and at the kind of other resources that go along with it. If you're not a member of DMU staff, you won't be able to access that link at present, although we're going to make those available externally. But if you just drop us a message saying you'd like a copy, we can certainly make sure that you have access to the PDF of that. I'm sure that this is not going to be the end of the discussion. There's lots more to say on this issue, but thank you very much for everybody who's taken part, and I hope it's been helpful to you.
And thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome.